Now, mass rallies have been held across Japan, calling on the government to shun nuclear power. More protests are expected on Monday, exactly 2 years after a huge earthquake and tsunami triggered the world's worst atomic disaster in 25 years. The quake and tsunami killed almost 19,000 people and crippled the Fukushima plant in northeastern Japan, causing meltdowns, spewing radiation, and forcing tens of thousands to flee their homes. Well, today, all but 2 of Japan's nuclear reactors remain switched off since the disaster. But the Prime Minister, whose party fosters pro-nuclear policies to modernize the nation, wants to restart those reactors and maybe even build new ones. Well, the demonstrators aren't convinced. They say Japan could easily phase out atomic power because it only counts for around 16% of total power production, as you can see in the chart here. Most of the country's energy still comes from fossil fuels, and it's got a long way to go to improve its renewable energy sources. But at the same time, the disgraced nuclear power also proves to be the cheapest among other resources. And this could be crucial for reviving the economy as fuels come at least at double prices compared to atomic energy. Well, at this point, let's assess Japan's recovery and its struggling relationship with nuclear fuel with Robert Jacobs. He's an expert in the social and cultural aspects of nuclear technologies and an associate professor at the Hiroshima Peace University. And he's joining us live now from Japan. Well, Robert, how would you assess the progress in cleaning up the radiation and, in fact, the decommission of crippled reactors?
We're currently just at the beginning of a process that will have to go on for decades. So it's hard to talk about anything except preparing to begin the work of decommissioning the reactors. There are still buildings on the plant at Fukushima Daiichi that human beings cannot enter. There's a lot of work that cannot be done yet because the radiation levels are too high. So at this point, what's being done is that the grounds are being prepared for the work to come, but a lot of that work is still theoretical. How to remove the fuel, how to lessen the radiation there on the site, and how to decommission the plants. These are not plans that exist. These are plans that still have to be created. So we're really at the very, very beginning of a long process.
Well, certainly it takes a lot of time, and as we know, I mean, it takes years. For example, you live in Hiroshima, and only, what, 40 or 50 years after the nuclear bomb was dropped there, I mean, the city is still sort of analyzing and assessing the damage, right? And it takes time, as we know. But what about rebuilding shattered communities? I mean, hundreds of thousands of people. Remember, 2 years ago, we saw dramatic images coming out of Japan, and people who were left homeless by this disaster, by tsunami that hit the country. So almost an equal number evacuated due to the reactor meltdown. What is being done now to help those people? I mean, is the effort that is the help that they're getting enough?
No, it's not nearly enough. The people who are being given help are the people who were forced to evacuate from within inside a 12-kilometer area. So there's some liability for them having to leave. A lot of people are outside of that area and were suggested to evacuate. For those who evacuated themselves, there is no compensation. For the people who were forced to evacuate, there has been some compensation in terms of some money to live on per month. Some of that is in the form of a loan, which is supposed to be paid back. None have yet been compensated for loss of property or loss of income. So there's also other aspects to the ways in which they're not being treated with the real devotion to their care that should happen. For example, in the Fukushima prefecture, data about some of the dose levels in areas where people were exposed was erased from a computer database. So this makes it impossible to ascertain what kinds of exposures people had. This degrades their ability to understand what to expect in the future health-wise, and also for them to be able to press any kind of legal case.
Well, let's now talk about nuclear energy and the relationship that the people of Japan have with it. I mean, their attitude towards it, and also specifically, what's the take of the government on this issue, as we know that the new government looks set to revive atomic projects. So what is your prediction here? I mean, will Japan restart its switched-off reactors?
I believe they absolutely will switch them on because they've invested in them, and these are huge assets for the country, so they will not be left idle. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I think there will be increasing public protests. I think that there's two reasons to look at this. One is that the cost of nuclear energy is not so low as it seems. That's the cost of nuclear energy if nothing goes wrong. But as we can see, things go wrong. And if you factor in the costs of these disasters, it's far from an affordable form of energy. On top of that, I would say that since we are really at the beginning of understanding the impact of the exposures and the contaminations, regardless of what policies are chosen, regardless of how strong or weak the anti-nuclear movement is at any given moment, this is an emerging situation. So we're going to become more and more aware of what the health impacts and health consequences and contaminations are. So this isn't like a kind of political question where there's a policy and people support it or don't support it. We're in a dynamic situation where people are only going to become more and more aware of the toll that this accident and the entry of this radioactivity into the ecosystem has taken on society. And I believe that that will only reinforce and build the anti-nuclear movement over time.
Well, what you just mentioned is certainly interesting because you said, I mean, you mentioned the economic aspects of using the nuclear energy, and you said it's not really cheap as some may think it is. So my question to you would be, what are then the reasons behind, reactivation of the nuclear plant?
Because the investment has been made. In some ways, look at it this way. If a football team has paid $100 million for a star player, if the star player is performing extremely badly and not scoring goals, that star player is still going to be sent out onto the field every day because the investment was made. There's a lot of companies in Japan who've invested a huge amount of money in nuclear power plants. The value of those companies is dependent on the value of those assets. So if we just simply remove them from being of value to those companies, the value of the companies and their share price will fall and the economy will dip. So supporting it is very much about supporting the economy as much as it is choosing it as a viable energy source.
And what about alternative sources of energy? I mean, is Japan financially ready to explore other, possibilities, alternatives there? You said, okay, fair enough. What you mentioned there does make sense. And but then on the other hand, are there alternative sources of energy? As we're saying that nuclear energy is not always safe.
Yes, there are, and a lot of that is in development now. And so the question of how feasible they are and which forms will become more integrated and more used in the long term will depend on how they develop and the kinds of investments that are put into them. But the nuclear industry had essentially slowed down in the developed world because it is not cost efficient. So that's not really a viable way forward. Especially when you consider that the waste needs to be contained for hundreds of thousands of years, which is longer than humans have had agriculture by 20 times. And so the costs of it are very high. So it's hard for me to say, as a person who's not an energy policy expert, which are the most feasible and viable paths. But it certainly will be something besides nuclear power, and most likely be something sustainable related to wave energy, solar power, wind power. There's a variety of energies incipient in the environment that have not been utilized sufficiently to provide energy.
All right, Robert Jacobs, Associate Professor at the Hiroshima Peace University. Thank you so much for joining us here on RT and sharing your views with us.